Hey everyone, so welcome back to the second episode of Logical Chess. And in this video, I want to present two games, one played by Rubinstein and another played by Capablanca. In the first game, we'll see how Rubinstein is able to convert a static advantage to a simple win. So a simple advantage of the pawn structure, how that is able to deliver him a win. And in the second game, we'll see how Capablanca is able to take advantage of his opponent's mistakes, specifically the concept of overextending, and how in the pursuit of increasing one's advantage, maybe the pieces going forward may actually become more vulnerable than they are powerful. They may become targets for our own pieces. So yeah, let's just get right into the game. The first game is Eric Kahn versus Akiba Rubinstein. The game started with d4, d5, knight f3, c5. So already this is very interesting because this is not one of the main moves, but the idea is just to kind of tempt white into taking on c5, so that in this case, if that happens, then either moves like knight f6 or pawn to e6 are fine, and next bishop takes c5 will restore material equality and just get the bishop out on the square. So that's the idea behind c5, very similar to like the Queen's Gambit decline, where white plays the move c4, tempting black into taking on c4. But instead, after c5, white plays the correct move, pawn to c4, trying to open up the position, since black is kind of lagging in development a bit, and the center is a bit unstable. And so in this position, best is probably just to play the move e6, which directly transposes into the Taurash variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. But here, d takes c4 was chosen, and this is not a good move objectively, because white is able to actually advance the pawn to d5. Now, this wasn't played in the game, but the idea behind this, why this is so good for white, is that this pawn on d5 really restricts black's position. For example, it prevents knight c6 from happening, and it kind of makes, pawn to e6 kind of not achieve much. For example, after pawn to e6, trying to undermine the center, pawn to e4 just firmly grips the d5 square. So now, for example, if you take on e6, then this would be a very good transformation for black, clearly. First off, they're up a pawn, and secondly, they get their bishop out. So instead, e4 is best, but after e takes d5 and e takes d5, white has a nice advantage because the pawn on c4 will drop next. And basically, this pawn on d5 is just very difficult to deal with. Again, the problem is that this knight on c6 doesn't really get a nice square to develop. For example, playing b5 here is very risky. A move like b3 here would be very nice, I think. Just undermining the pawn chain, or even a move like a4 I think is already much better for white. So instead of that, in the game, white played the move d takes c5, which kind of allowed this queen exchange, and black brought the knight out to c6, which they basically solve all of the problems in the opening. The knight gets out of c6, and black has a reasonable position here. White plays the move e3, preparing to recapture on c4 with the bishop. And first off, black takes the opportunity to develop the bishop out here. So it would make sense here probably to develop the bishop outwards, so maybe f4 or something like this, and only then play the move e3, so that the bishop isn't actually locked in to the pawn chain. For example, after pawn to e3, which was played in the game, this bishop is kind of a possibly problem piece, but surely it can also be redeployed on this long diagonal. So this is like a fine move, but just another idea that was possible. So now black plays the move bishop g4, just getting the bishop out of the pawn chain, and now bishop takes c4, and now black wants to kind of like shut down this bishop, so they play the move e6, and now they will take on c5 next to restore the material balance. And now white plays a3, which is quite a typical idea. First off, it prepares b4 to hold on to the pawn, and secondly, after bishop takes c5, white wants to expand with b4 so that their bishop gets the nice square on b2 to develop. And now black plays the move bishop d6. So the point is to fight over control over the e5 square. So for example, after bishop e7, this bishop is kind of less active than it was on d6. So bishop d6 makes a lot of sense. And after bishop e2, black plays the move knight f6. And after knight d2, just developing, black plays the first interesting move, the move king e7. And the thing is that there's no need to castle in this position because it's an endgame. And so the king is actually more useful in the endgame, and so you want to get it active. Now, obviously not too active, like you don't want to put this king right in the center of the board. But later, when a lot of pieces have been exchanged and it no longer poses a direct threat for black, then the idea of activating the king to the center makes a lot of sense. So now white plays the move king e2, probably thinking that they're kind of mimicking black, but now black plays a very strong move, bishop e5. Now the point is that king e2 kind of just walks into this pin, so now bishop e5 manages to exchange white's good bishop here, a bishop that was slicing throughout this diagonal, exchange it for the slightly less active bishop, and after takes, sure, like white can play the move bishop e3, but simply black will play a move like rook hd8 and develop normally and get nice control over the d file here. So rook hc1 is played instead, so that the bishop at least still controls the d3 square. And now black plays move rook ac8, just developing, bishop e3, and now rook hd8. So black has essentially developed their pieces optimally, and like of course there's nothing wrong per se with white's position. Position is still equal, but certainly black has doesn't have any issues at all in this position. So now here, white plays the move knight c4, and this kind of exchanges pieces, and probably white thought that this was getting closer to a draw, which is true. But after knight takes c4, rook c4, black decides to take on c4 and bring the knight to e4, trying to activate it. And so first off, there is a potential threat of rook d2 here, for example, making use of this pin, and also possibly knight c3 in the air. So now white plays the move king e1, and this is the first another interesting decision that Rubinstein made in this game, which is to play the move bishop takes f3. So it's common knowledge that it's common wisdom that the bishop is actually worth more than the knight, just like a slightly more. And so in this open position, why does black take on f3? Now the point is very simple, that you want to double the pawns. And objectively this is still equal. But the idea is that Rubinstein just wants to play against this kind of double pawn and have this kind of static advantage, this long-term static advantage. Now, of course, if white is able to activate their bishop, their light squared bishop, and make it more useful and more relevant than the fact that these pawns are doubled, then simply, white will be better. But black, can play actively enough to prevent this from happening. Knight d6, hitting the bishop, bishop e2, rook c8, taking over the open file, king d2, and now knight c4 check. And here you could of course move the king away, but bishop takes c4 makes sense. The rook takes c4, and now white plays the losing mistake. They play the move rook c1, and playing this move, they definitely thought that they were getting closer to a draw. But yeah, if you'd like to find the solution, if you haven't seen this game before, of how black can win, please pause the video and do so. Okay, so now the idea is that because black has inflicted these double pawns, the structure becomes very weak, and this pawn on h2 becomes isolated. We can see that now, if we compare the number of pawn islands, white has 3 pawn islands here, pawns that are split into their own regions, while black has simply 2 pawn islands here, meaning that this pawn on h2 is especially weak. So yeah, there's also the interesting dynamic of the fact that these pawns are doubled. So in a typical middle game position, these pawns being doubled doesn't really matter that much. It might actually be useful to control a lot of these central squares here. But in this endgame, this is very bad because it creates the problem of this weak h2 pawn. And now black exchanges the rooks and simply activates the king. So now the simple plan is just to advance the king forward here to h3, just to attack the h2 pawn, and later advance all of the pawns available. For example, with g5, h5, fix the pawn structure on the king side as well, on the queen side as well, and we can see how this game continues. King d2, king g5, king e2. White is essentially forced to become passive. That's also another factor we need to see in the endgame, where the king is much more active than the black king is much more active than the white king, and so black has something to play for. King h4, king f1, king h3, king g1. Now we can see that white is essentially forced to waiting here. They can only shuffle back and forth or make any pawn moves here. So now black plays a move e5, just trying to fix these pawns. King h1, b5, fixing these pawns as well, preventing them from moving forward. King g1, and now f5. And simply after king h1, black plays g5 next. And let's say after king g1, sure, playing a move like g4 is probably a winning, but why not improve the position ever so slightly more by playing the move h5, because this is a move that we want to play anyways. King h1, and now g4. So now the threat is taking on f3, so e4 was played. And now black exchanges on e4 and simply advances to h4. So now the simple threat of g3 is unstoppable. And after we get g3 in, takes, white simply resigned here because there's nothing more to be done. For example, you can't go you can't go king h1 because they'll take on f2 with mate next. If you go here, then after I believe the simple king h2, preparing g2 next, takes. Eventually, this pawn on e4 will be outflanked. So yeah, for example, we can see the computer already evaluates this as a simple win because let's just say here, and at some point the white pawn is going to be lost and black is going to win. So yeah, that's a very simple and easy win by Rubinstein, which of course was equal throughout most of the game, but it showed a difference in understanding of exchanging these rooks. So the move rook c1 is a losing blunder, and this kind of showed that how big of a problem having the double pawns and especially this isolated pawn in the endgame is. And so this kind of improved our understanding of such positions and the double pawn dynamics. The second game we can see is by Capablanca against Albert Winning Fox. The game continued e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now bishop e5. So we entered the Spanish game, and of course the idea behind the Spanish game is to, first off, white develops the knight to f3 attacking the e5 pawn, black develops the knight to c6 to defend the e5 pawn, and now white puts the bishop on b5 so that they can first off prepare castling, and also they put indirect pressure on the center. So even though the move bishop e4 looks like it makes more sense because it controls the central d5 square, the move bishop e5 is good as well because it puts indirect pressure on the center, since this knight on c6 is defending the pawn on e5. And so the potential threat of bishop takes c6 in the future is there so that the e5 pawn can be taken. And so here black plays move knight f6, which like a6 is also possible and possibly a move that black wants to play, but knight f6 was played, also counterattacking e4. And now white castles. So after castles, the point is that taking on e4, which is the main line here, allows either one of two moves, either pawn to d4, trying to open up the position and trying to open up the e file as well. For example, if e takes d4, then rook e1 is quite nice, because making use of the fact that the king is still stuck in the center. And instead, if knight d6, then this enters a typical Berlin endgame, which I don't really want to go into, but there is a position that can happen after bishop takes e6 here. But essentially that's possible, and so e4 is kind of like a poison pawn, if you will. And so even though it's possible and it's like the main line, but in this game bishop e7 was played. So with this move, black simply prepares castling and blocks the pressure on the e-file. So now potentially taking on e4 is a more serious idea because there is no threat on the black king on the e-file here. So now rook e1 is played, defending e4, and now there's a serious threat of bishop takes e6. And so black needs to play the move d6. So yeah, for example, if we castle here, then bishop takes e6 simply wins a pawn on e5. Since now we cannot take on e4 because the rook is guarding it. So instead d6 is forced. And if we look at the position, actually black has quite a passive position here because all of the pieces are in the third rows or third ranks of their position. And so none of them are really active here per se. And white immediately strikes in the center with pawn to d4, trying to open up the position and gain a space advantage. And here best, and what was played in the game, is e takes d4. So it's important actually to take on d4 now, because if we play a move like castling, a move like d5 here would be a bit annoying, just kicking the knight back, gaining a lot of space, and white is known to have an edge in these kind of positions. So e takes d4 was played. After knight takes d4, there's a threat on c6 here, so black needs to parry the threat with bishop d7. And white plays the typical move knight c3 here. Now, after black castles here, there are a lot of moves that have been tried, and I watched this video recently by Grandmaster Matthew Sadler from the United Kingdom, who's a big engine expert and also a very strong grandmaster, where he showed this game Janowski versus Emmanuel Lasker. And he showed a lot of the ideas and the context of this position, because this was a very popular tabia back in the 1900s, because this variation of the Ruy Lopez, basically with playing the move d6, very similar to what is known as a Steinitz defense, led by Wilhelm Steinitz, the first world champion. And so back then, this line was quite popular with bishop d7, knight c3, and castles. And so white has tried a lot to try to prove an advantage here. And for example, Siegbert Tarasch favored this move bishop f1, just saying that basically I'm going to keep all of black's pieces at bay here, being quite passive in this position. And so from this video, by the way, that I mentioned, yeah, it's really nice to hear about the context of this game and how theory was back in the day. And so I'm just gonna reiterate some of the ideas that were mentioned in that video. So one move that was tried was this move knight takes c6. This was tried by Siegbert Tarasch actually against Emmanuel Lasker in their World Championship match, which continued this way after bishop ac6, trying to exchange pieces. Bishop takes c6 and bc6, we can see that there are the double pawns here, but this isn't as simple as the previous game, because this isn't like a simple king and pawn endgame, and the white king isn't that active compared to the black king, as a result. So here in the game that I mentioned, knight e2 was played with the idea that actually, well, you cannot take on e4 first off, and the knight is actually coming to g3, where it can be more useful to potentially infiltrate on f5. For example, if you cannot take on e4 here because knight d4 comes, and both the pawn at c6 and the knight on e4 is hanging, so that's not possible. Instead, queen d7 was played in that game by Lasker. After knight g3, redeploying the knight to a better square, rook f to e8, b3, and a rook a d8. So according to the chess principles, like besides getting the passive position with the bishop and the knight here, black has essentially done what they could with bringing the rooks in and the queen into the game. But notice that these rooks, even though they're on the central files are not open, and so these rooks are quite poor actually. And white deploys the bishop to b2, and this was the entire idea behind white's setup, is that they're able to put pressure on this diagonal, and later with the idea of knight f5 potentially really target this g7 pawn. And so white develops a strong initiative here, and white is already much better. And in the game, black already blundered here with the move knight g4, which fell into bishop takes g7, which is a very nice tactic. The point is that if you take on g7, knight f5 comes, and this disconnects the queen's defense over the knight, so that now after the king moves, the knight will simply drop. First off, white is up a pawn, and more importantly, the black king is completely exposed. So knight takes f2 was played, a so-called desperado move, hitting the queen. So now white decides to take on f2, king takes g7, knight f5, king h8, and white played the move queen d4 check, provoking f6. And somehow Lasker won this position as black. Yeah, but clearly he's like simply lost here if black plays accurately. If white plays accurately. Even though they're not up material, the knight is much better than the bishop here. The knight on f5. This bishop is just passive. It's being blocked in by their own pawns. The king is completely exposed here. And overall, white is simply winning. But that's just one of the ideas that was employed in the past. But instead, this move knight d2, which the idea is to keep pieces on the board. And it's also still possible to bring the knight out to g3, maybe play the pawn to b3 and bishop b2, and also develop with the same ideas as before, except that white is not exchanging so many pieces on c6 there. And so with more pieces on the board, this can maybe allow for more attacking chances. And yeah, that's the idea. After rook e8, just developing, preparing bishop f8 to regroup as well as put pressure on the center here with the rook. Okay, we can see that first off, like one way to improve this bishop is actually to put it on the long diagonal. How can you do that? Which the only way you can do is really by playing the move rook e8 and then bringing the bishop back to f8 so that it can deploy on the long diagonal on g7 here. And so black starts his typical maneuver, rook e8, knight g3, and now knight e5. So bishop f8 was possible immediately, but knight e5 was played. And now the point is to exchange some, pieces. And I quite like the move actually, like a move like bishop f1 here, just to keep pieces on the board, and sell the idea of f4 still in the air. Maybe playing a move like h3 first is useful to take control over the g4 square, and then advance with f4. But instead bishop takes c7. And so the typical wisdom is that if you're kind of cramped on space, if you are lacking space in a position, you want to exchange pieces. So in that sense, black has kind of gotten a bit closer to their goals. Queen takes g7 was played, connecting the rooks. So now they're defending each other, preparing to bring the rook in. f4 was played, knight g6, and now knight f5. So knight f5 is already a serious inaccuracy here. What could have been done is played a more calm and patient move, a move like h3, just keeping the position together and not overextending here. h3 is quite a useful move to give the king some luft, as well as control the g4 square, preventing any future knight g4, which actually happens in the game. So knight f5 is played, but now after the simple bishop f8, it's suddenly the question is like, what is the knight even doing on f5? Is it actually useful to begin with? And so queen d3 was played, just defending the e4 pawn and preparing to bring the bishop in, rook a d8, and now bishop d2. So let's just say that if in a hypothetical situation this bishop was on b2 instead, for example on this diagonal, then this would be a dangerous position. But the problem is that this pawn on f4 is actually being hit by the knight, and so white of course can spend a tempo playing a move like g3, but if they want to develop here, then and not waste any time with a move like g3, then they're gonna have to play a move like bishop d2, which is not ideal. And now, having all of these pieces perfectly placed, black is ready to strike in the center with d5. And now e takes d5 here would just allow the move bishop c5 check, getting a nice tempo in and activating the bishop. And next, okay, we can just see, for example, king h1. You can even like take on e8 or knight takes d5 at some point. Let's see, knight takes d5, rook e8 takes, doesn't really work. But at some point, this pawn is going to fall. Yeah, not sure. Maybe, perhaps this move at g4 as well, like what happened in the game, is very strong, and white is running into some problems with knight f2 check here. So instead, e5 is played, but a similar sequence happens, and after bishop c5 check, king h1, knight g4 was played, and now there's the immediate threat of knight f2, which white needs to parry. And so they can only really play one move, which is knight d1, preventing knight f2 check to win material. And now, seeing that this center is overextended and it's actually kind of a target for black plays a very strong move f6. And the point is that if you take on f6, first off, you can like take on e1 just to underdevelop the bishop here on e1. But also the simple knight takes f6 here is quite good. Actually, I believe that after ef6, knight takes f6 is fine, and this kind of shows that this pawn on f4 is more of a weakness than a strength, because it opens up the white king. But also, I believe simply taking on e1 and then taking on f4 here is decisive, because the queen is actually guarding this knight and it's forced to move away. So that's the idea. And so white plays the move h3 here, which is correct. And after knight f2 check, a very important move, otherwise the knight doesn't want to retreat, so takes, hitting the rook. And now white plays the game-losing mistake here, which is rook e2. So the difference between rook f1 and rook e2 is very concrete, actually. So the reason that rook f1 is actually better is because the rook doesn't become as vulnerable as it is on e2. For example, after f takes e5, white can play the move knight takes g7. And the move pawn to e4, which we want to play to kind of preserve our center and hitting the queen. Of course, like if white moves the queen away, then we're going to be much better just winning the knight. But the problem is that they have this move knight takes e8, and they have this threat of knight f6, and so the white queen can't be taken, and so they're going to be simply winning material here. And so the thing is that after rook e2 and fe5, rook f2 was played. And the pawn is pawn to e4. And okay, this is exactly what happened. But let's say we go for the same desperado move that we saw before. This doesn't work because after pawn to e4, let's say knight takes e8, as in the previous variation, there's a threat of knight f6. But now, black is just in time to take on d3, and noting that the rook on e2 is actually hanging here because of the pawn on d3. And so instead of white winning material, black simply wins a load of material. For example, knight f6 check, king f7 takes, and simply the knight has to move away. This pawn is gonna promote very soon. Yeah, and black is simply winning here. So instead, after rook e2, which is a mistake, f takes e5, rook takes f2 was played, and now e4. And now, seeing that this knight is kind of disconnected, white plays the move knight h6 check to say that at least, okay, like at least even though I'm giving up the knight or giving up a pawn after this exchange, at least these pawns are doubled and offside. So now white plays the move queen d4, and now queen g7. So this is the point. Black doesn't fear entering the endgame because in the endgame, these pawns are very powerful, and the pawns will simply roll up the board and lead black to victory. So queen takes a7 was played, avoiding the exchange of queens. But now black takes on b2, is still up a pawn, and has these two center pawns, very strong. Rook e1, now pawn to d4. And simply the threat of e3 is very difficult to deal with. f5 was played, but now e3, hitting the rook, which is more valuable than the knight. So now rook f to e2, and now knight f4. And simply the rook on e2 is trapped, and black is going to be winning material here, no matter what white does. Bishop c1 hitting the queen, and now queen b6. Again, black is ready to enter the endgame because they're going to win material, first off. And secondly, it's going to be a very easy win because of these very strong connected pawns. And for queen a4, knight takes e2, queen c4 check, just hitting the, just giving a check, trying to expose the king. But rook takes e2, and simply black is up like so much material. Queen a6 was played, which is a very nice move actually. The point is that you kind of like skewer this queen and the rook, and so now if you take on a6, simply we'll get a very similar position to the game. Move like c5 here. Next would just get connected pass pawns. So instead queen d3 was played, but now after takes, black plays the move c5. And after white tries to play the move g4, black now plays the move c4 and breaks through. The point is obviously after it takes here, you can play pawn to d3 here, I believe. And after rook takes e3, you can trade off the rooks, play pawn to d2, and simply promote the pawn. And so, yeah, from this position already, white decided to resign. And so this game kind of showed the concept of overextending, and how the pieces going forward doesn't necessarily mean that one side is increasing their advantage. Of course, in like some positions, for example, like in the variation of the Alekhine, like in the four pawns attack, this is completely justified. Let's say here, d4, d6, c4, knight b6, and f4. This kind of extending with these pawns forward is very justified because black in turn has spent so many moves with the knight, and so white gets a very nice advantage in this position, which is very different to what happened in the game, where we saw that white isn't actually ready to support their far advanced pieces, and instead got struck in the center with the move with the break pawn to d5, and later the king got very exposed. And so, yeah, that's basically a couple of the things that I learned from this game as well. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any comments or suggestions, please comment those down below. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.